Hi, I'm Mel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing my grandmother's chicken dumpling soup recipe. I had originally filmed this back in February. I know it's now May, but for some reason Mother Nature decided we were going to have a redo of February, complete with ice on the front porch. So now's a perfect time to share a soup recipe. So this is not your traditional Southern chicken dumpling. This is something that I grew up with, and it really came out of a community of Croatian immigrants. So it's going to be a little bit of a variation of what you would normally expect to see with a chicken dumpling soup. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so in the pot we already have two 48-ounce containers of chicken broth. I like using a reduced sodium chicken broth just because I can always add salt later. It's hard to take it back out. I'm going to season this up with some garlic powder, some Italian seasoning, and some black pepper. Now I like a lot of garlic, so I'm going to put in 2 tablespoons of garlic powder. I'm going to add a teaspoon and a little extra pinch there of Italian seasoning. And I think we'll add a teaspoon of black pepper. And we're going to go ahead and cover this and bring this to a boil, because next we're going to add the chicken. But the chicken works best if you put it into a boiling pot of chicken broth. Okay, you can see it's starting to foam. We're at a boil. I'm going to give this a stir to kind of swirl in all of our herbs and seasoning here. And then what I'm going to do, before I put the chicken in, I'm going to take a cup of diced onion and put that in to soften a little bit. If you don't like onion, don't worry about it. You can always adjust. I like a lot of onion as well. Most of this will really shrink down in size and not be a very chunky part of our soup. But I'm going to give this a little bit of a moment to help season the broth while we get the chicken ready. And while my chicken is cooking, I'm going to get started on prepping the vegetables. I have 3 stalks of celery. Feel free to add more if you like it. Celery is not my personal favorite, so I tend to limit that a little more. And 4 carrots. Again, number of carrots really depends on personal preference. It also depends on the size of your carrot. Unless you're buying the little baby ones and just want to chop those up too, that's okay. I'm going to cut off some of the rough ends. I've already peeled the carrots. I'm going to get some of the greenery off the celery. And I'll set that out for my friendly neighborhood groundhog. It's the middle of winter. I'm sure she'd appreciate a snack. She just came out of hibernation on Groundhog's Day. I don't like my celery super chunky, so I'm not going to cut it very big. It will shrink up a little bit in the cooking process. Carrots are the same way. They'll shrivel a little bit, but they tend to hold their shape better. So keep this in mind when sort of determining how chunky you want things to be. Now, by using pre-made chicken broth, I've sort of violated my grandmother's 2 days to make soup procedure, but I don't have 2 days to make soup, so I don't know very many people that do have 2 days to make soup. So I go ahead and use a pre-purchased chicken broth and season it up a little bit to my liking. Cooking the chicken in it also helps to give it a little more flavor, so I don't feel too bad by taking a little shortcut there. I'm also going to take a little bit of a shortcut with tomatoes later. I'm going to use 2 cans of diced tomatoes because I like tomato in mine. My grandmother used to take a piece of cheesecloth, tie it around a couple of tomatoes, and then cook the soup with the tomatoes in there, but then pull the cheesecloth out. and didn't actually have chunks of tomato in her soup. So I don't know how she'd really feel about me having actual free-floating tomatoes in there, but it's good for you, so, you know, not going to worry about it too much. I could use real fresh tomatoes, but unfortunately right now nothing is really looking too good at the grocery store. So I'm going to use some canned tomatoes that have a little bit of garlic in them, and we'll just call it good. Finish up. Now, if some of these carrot pieces are looking a little big to you, feel free to cut them down. You know, especially if you're making something for small children and are concerned about choking or anything like that, feel free. Cut it down a little bit. Again, these are going to soften in the soup, and they will shrink in size a little bit, but, you know, if you're sitting there going, I don't want huge chunks of carrot, that's okay. Like I said before, if you happen to have a bag of baby cut carrots sitting in your refrigerator, cut those up. I've done that before. It's not a big deal. It gets the same effect. It's just that they're already peeled for you and they're not going to be as big of a chunk. So you can see I've taken a few of the larger pieces and cut them in half. So that will be a little bit better, and just look over what you have and see if you like it. You know, if you need to cut it up a little bit more, go for it. And I have a few pieces falling off the cutting board. So we're checking on our chicken. It's been 15 minutes. We're gonna look and see how easily it pulls apart with a fork. You can tell that it's looking done, but I really want it to fall apart a little bit more than what we have here. So I think we're gonna leave it in just a little bit longer, give it about another 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll check on it again. So while we finish up our chicken, we're gonna go ahead and start prepping our dumplings. Now, this is not your traditional Southern dumpling, so don't post comments about that. This is my grandparents' dumpling recipe. This is something that was passed down from Croatian immigrants, so I make no claims as to authenticity regarding a Southern dumpling. I started with 5 cracked eggs, large eggs, nothing too exciting there. I'm going to go ahead and put in half a teaspoon of salt. We don't need a lot of salt in here. It's going to pick it up from the broth as we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in about 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking powder. So I'm just going to sprinkle that over the top. This is going to help them float. And we're going to do this old school. We're going to start beating it by hand with a fork. This was the point at which my grandmother would give the bowl to my grandfather and have him go to town. So you're going to just go and get things a bit combined. Now for the flour that we're going to add, it's not an exact science. This is something where you go by feel and more or less what it looks like, because we're going to go for a stiff and sticky dough. I'm going to start by sprinkling in a cup of flour. And as I go along, I will add by half cup measure. But for here, we're just going to start and get it to come together a bit. Now, if you wanted to add a little bit of white pepper to your dumplings, you can. I'm not going to because I usually don't. And I also put black pepper in my broth. So I'm going to get some flavoring off that anyway. It looks lumpy and clumpy. It's not very attractive here. It's also still very, very loose. This is nowhere near enough flour in here, but we're going to keep going. So, as I said before, I'm going to add this in by a half cup at a time now. My grandmother never sifted a thing in her life, so I'm not worrying about sifting my flour. These are not going to be smooth. These are going to look like rough puffy clouds, not puppy clouds, puffy clouds. And so we just want a dough, for lack of a better term. It's not really a batter, it's not really a dough. As you can see, it's stiffening up a bit. It's still not quite where I want it to be. So I think another half cup will do us. I may even cut it a little shy of that. We'll see here. Put about a quarter cup and a little extra in. So again, not an exact science. Now here we have it where it is pulling away from the bowl. So that's roughly where we're going to want it. It's still sticky, but it's coming together, it's holding together, and I think we're at the point we want to be with this. Now, what this is going to do when we drop it in the boiling water is that it's going to go ahead and absorb some of that liquid. It's going to absorb our chicken broth, and it's going to puff up quite nicely. Now, you may be asking why I haven't put all the vegetables in yet. I haven't put the tomatoes in yet, I haven't put the carrots in yet, or the celery. This is because of color. When you put this in, it's going to be an off-white color. I've done this before where I've put in the carrots and the tomatoes first. You end up with a little bit more of an orangey colored dumpling. So for the sake of the color of the dumpling, I'm going to hold off on the vegetables until the end. So we're gonna go back and take a look at our chicken and see where we stand on that. If the chicken's ready, we'll get the dumplings in the broth. Okay, so we're gonna pull out some of our chicken. Yeah, it looks like it's ready to fall apart now. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna scoop this out and put it in a bowl. I'm gonna let it cool a moment before I try to shred it, because we're gonna go ahead and get our dumplings going. Make sure I don't have any chunks of chicken floating around in the bottom. Now you can, what I'm doing right now is sort of getting some of the chicken bits and seasonings off of the side. If you want to scrape that off and just dispose of it, you can. I like having it in there. A little bit of cloudiness never bothered anybody. So next what we're going to do is start the dumplings. We're still boiling, so we're still good there. Spoon, just a regular spoon, nothing too exciting. This is not exotic kitchen tools for this recipe. I'm basically heating up the spoon because what I want it to do is when I scoop up our dumpling batter and put it into the pot, I really want it to just slide off into the broth nicely. I would prefer it not stick. This is also about the right size to get a good dumpling. So I'm gonna go ahead, scoop a bit out, and just give it a little bit of a swirl. It's a little stuck this time, not quite the effort I wanted, but first one's always a little tricky. And again, it's going to be craggy. It's going to be rough looking. This is not something that's beautiful. It's delicious. It's just not beautiful, but that's okay. You can see that one went off a little easier. That one slid off. And so what you do is you just keep going, scooping these in. and giving them a little bit of love. In some ways, it's like when you make matzo balls and you know you've done a good job when things float. And that's the goal. We want things to eventually float. We don't want them to sink. And quite honestly, I do a similar process with my matzo balls in terms of making actual soup. So this is just more of a white flour version. So go ahead and keep dropping these in. You can see that they puff up because they're absorbing the water. They'll go, or the chicken broth, and they'll get a little bit bigger. Naturally, if you're feeding more people and you want to have more dumplings, or if you're someone that is going to eat most of the dumplings the first day, you can always put your soup in a pot, your leftover soup, the next day, and make a fresh batch of dumpling batter. And see, we're getting a little group right in here. You don't want to stir it too much at this point. You don't want to break them. I'm making them fairly substantial because this is going to be dinner, not just a accompaniment or an appetizer. This is not the soup course, this is dinner. So these are going to be a little more substantial. And again, you don't need to worry about having them all exactly the same. This is what they call rustic. We like rustic. It's easy, no fancy tools, no crazy recipes. You do a lot of things just because that's how you like them. And like I said before, if you don't like a lot of onion, don't put in a lot of onion. If you don't like garlic, don't put in the garlic. Okay. And just because I have some on the fork, I'm just going to dip the fork I used to do that in there. Get a little bit. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat on this down to a lower heat. And I'm going to cover it up and let these get tender. So we're back to our chicken. It's been cooling a little bit while we did our dumplings. I'm going to use sort of the tried and true measure where you take 2 forks and you shred, because it just fills out nicely when you're putting everything together and you have these nice little threads of chicken. Now, if you prefer your chicken chunkier or diced, go ahead and go that route. Again, I like being able to have a few more threads to mine, just so you can get a little more chicken in each bite, as opposed to, you know, just having a bite of vegetables and then a bite of chicken. I like having a little bit of both in my spoon. So, because this is still warm, it goes fairly quickly. And since you're waiting for your dumplings to soften up a little bit, you're going to have to kill the time somehow, right? But this was something that I grew up eating. This was just so common. Grandma would be having batches of soup working on the stove or cooling in the refrigerator. Now, because hers was a 2-day process and she made her own stock, and she used a little bit more dark meat chicken when making the stock, you would come in the morning and look at her refrigerator, and there would be this container of soup with an orange layer of grease on top of it. And she would take it out and she would skim it and get all that grease off before she started the second day's process of getting the vegetables in and getting the chicken all shredded. So Because I'm using boneless, skinless chicken breast, I don't really have that congealed layer of grease in my final product. But that's okay. Sometimes those are weird, fond memories you have of doing these things. And I grew up in a Croatian community where there were a lot of families that were from immigrants that came over and worked in the packing houses, the slaughterhouses, or for the railroad. And so we all grew up basically eating the same things. There's a little bit of variation between everyone's chicken soup and their individual specialties. You know, and everyone had their own little area of town. I mean, even in Kansas, you had a lot of neighborhoods that were joined together by common ancestry. Everybody went to the church or the social groups that your particular heritage supported. So we had a Croatian men's club with a bowling alley that was under my grade school, which is a very strange thing when you grow up with a bar and a bowling alley underneath your grade school. But it makes for interesting life stories because no one ever believes you when you tell them that. But you grew up knowing everybody, and that was a really fun thing where half the people you ran into were family, and half the people were related to you in some way or another through marriage or other associations. So really it was a good way to go. Okay, so I have a few bigger pieces. I have a few smaller, threadier pieces. So it will all mix up nicely when you get it in the pot. Let me go ahead and break it down just a little bit more. Like I said, you can cut this up with a knife if you really want to. I just, like it shredded. It feels a little more rustic. Since your dumplings aren't going to be all neat and tidy, your chicken doesn't need to be all neat and tidy either. This is not a need to be Instagram perfect here. I think my grandmother would be appalled that we take so many pictures of our food, but I think at the same time her specialties were things of beauty, and I think she would be Insta famous, at least with some of the foodies, on some of the things that she's made. Okay, so I'm gonna leave the chicken at that, and we're gonna go back and check on our soup. So this has been cooking for a little bit. As you can see, carrots have softened up a bit, celery softened up a bit. You don't see quite as much liquid in the soup just because things are sort of absorbed, but we've come to the point we're going to add a little more liquid from our diced tomatoes. I'm going to try to do this without it splashing everywhere. This is 2 cans of diced tomatoes. I picked diced tomatoes that had garlic with them just because I like a little extra garlic. So we're going to give this a quick swirl. As you can see, it's going to change the color a little bit, and I don't like this little bit with the core, so we're going to pick that out. Don't be afraid to pick things out if the veggie looks a little weird. Okay, so we're back to a fairly full pot, and I'm going to go ahead and let this cook on a medium-low heat for about another hour and get everything, nicely softened, and let all those flavors blend together. And here we are at the end with our lovely bowl of soup with our dumplings, our chicken, and a lot of vegetables. Perfect for some cold February weather, that's for sure. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.